Welcome to another episode of Naval History and Heritage Command's podcast, Anchor in History, Stories of America's Navy. I'm your host, Cliff Davis. Today, for this episode of Archaeology Beneath the Waves, we're going to be discussing the Navy's mission to oversee one of the largest collections of submerged cultural resources, which includes over 2,500 shipwrecks and 15,000 aircraft wrecks dispersed around the world. Our guest is Ivor Mollema, an underwater archaeologist of Naval History and Heritage Command's Underwater Archaeology Branch, who, in 2023, was selected to present his paper, The Main Submerged and Underwater History, at the U.S. Navy Academy McMullen's Naval History Symposium, a world-renowned biennial event that highlights the latest research on naval and maritime history. Before I go any further, I need to state that the views expressed within this podcast are those of the individual speaker and do not reflect the position of NHHC, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. government, and specific entities discussed do not imply an endorsement of any organization. Thanks for joining me, Ivor, for quite an interesting topic that I'm sure listeners are out there thinking, underwater archaeology? So, to help answer the question right out the gate, how does your job of being an archaeologist that works underwater similar and yet different to one that's on land?
Sure, yeah. So you got lots of popular conceptions. Titanic's obviously the big one with submarines going down. Then there's kind of the wrong end of the spectrum with treasure hunters, fool's gold, and stuff like that. But essentially, when you take the traditional idea of archaeology on land, we apply those same principles just in a different environment. So we work under the same ethics with the same goals and try to apply as much of the same methods as possible. So we still work off of a grid system that you might see on land. We still scrape soil or dirt away in layers and record that stuff as much as possible, just as you would on land, whether that's photography. We have tools to draw underwater. We've got different excavation tools. So the big difference practically in the field is the environment, right? We work underwater. We work with scuba stuff if we're sending people down. We have other tools like ROVs. Our survey equipment's a little bit different because we work in that different environments. We've got side scan sonar, magnetometer, sub-bottom profilers. So the tools are a little bit different, but the ethics and the thinking and the learning behind it are very, very similar.
Now, how does someone become an underwater archaeologist?
So there's a couple of ways. I'll describe the academic one first, and then we can talk about some of the other ones. So I personally did my undergrad in ancient history and archaeology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and then did my master's at East Carolina University in maritime studies. So that was a master's in underwater archaeology specifically. So that was very specialized, right? There's specialized training. It's very focused on that. There's practical skills you learn. We studied shipbuilding because we knew we'd be studying ships for the most part, or marine architecture, stuff like that. The saying does, however, go that it's easier to teach an archaeologist to dive than it is to teach a diver to be an archaeologist. So it's a common saying that you'll hear. And it's more about teaching somebody how to do something is easier than teaching somebody how to think about something, right? So if you're a diver and you've been thinking about wrecks all the time, the way you think about wrecks is slightly different, not in a bad way, it's just slightly different than how archaeologists might view a wreck or a wreck site and what they can learn from it. So you teach somebody the practical skills, and there's a couple of ways to do that. Sometimes folks go through a terrestrial or a traditional archaeology program and they hear about underwater archaeology and they learn how to dive, they learn how to apply the methods, they go to a field school. There's also avocational or volunteer opportunities at certain places. Down in Florida, there's a whole bunch of maritime field schools that folks can attend. There's volunteer organizations, sometimes historical societies will have a little bit of information on it. And then there's also volunteer or avocational educational programs, like the Nautical Archaeology Society has a whole curriculum for folks to learn how to learn underwater archaeology skills, basically.
So then, have you completed any specialized diving or training courses along the way?
Yes. So I personally started diving when I was 10, so I got my basic PADI open water stuff, worked that all the way up until rescue diving. I'm now an assistant instructor. But the main diving teaching bodies don't teach you anything about underwater archaeology, right? They teach you kind of the practical skills, good buoyancy, how to stay clear of that stuff. So built within the ECU curriculum, for example, there was a lot of practical training underwater. So I received training in how to map a shipwreck underwater, how to take some underwater photographs, especially scientific underwater photographs, which is different than taking nice, pretty photographs. We want to make sure that the scale is in there, the north arrow is in there, that it's a flat surface. And then when it comes time for pretty photographs, we learn that too. Then, we learn how to use certain tools underwater. There's underwater dredges, which are like, and airlifts, which are kind of like underwater vacuum systems. So I talked before how we remove the dirt and systematically and in layers. As we scrape away the dirt, we need somewhere for it to go, right? Because if it just floats around in the air, it's going to impede our visibility and make our job harder. So that way we have this kind of underwater vacuum style system. It works off of either an air pressure difference or a water pressure difference. And it sucks water in and it'll take that dirt that you're scraping off with it. And so you learn how to use special tools like that. But all that stuff can also come in field school. So some of it is on the job learning, and then some of it was academically taught to me, and then a couple other ones were taught to me in separate courses that I've taken.
Now that is super interesting that your job is so uniquely specialized.
Yes. Yeah, it's a pretty niche subject.
So why does the Navy need underwater archaeologists?
Sure. So the Navy has a large collection of sunken military craft, which we'll talk about specifically a little bit later. But we have over 18,000 of them, and that number is continuously growing. So the Navy has never given up title to any of its sunken military craft, which means that it retains ownership of those craft. And those are around the world, but they need to be protected for a number of reasons. First and foremost is the potential presence of human remains, which means that they're treated as either war graves or grave sites in general. So we want to make sure those sites stay protected, and we have the skill set to do that. We want to make sure that the sites in general are protected, preserved, and studied, because we can learn from them. We can teach people about naval history. We can expand our knowledge base. There's lessons to be learned from certain aspects. We can change or supplement the historical narrative with material finds, stuff like that.
So would you mind explaining what the Underwater Archaeology Branch of NHHC does?
Yeah, of course. So we have four main functions. We've got archaeological research, artifact conservation and curation, policy development and resource management, and then public outreach. Those are our four main functions. Archaeological research speaks a little bit for itself. We go out and we research the SMCs, or sunken military craft, and we try and find out as much as we can. We try and establish a positive identity if we can. We try and protect, preserve them. Conservation and curation kind of falls a little bit under that, or works in tandem with that, in that if we recover anything during our research efforts, that's where conservation comes in. So we've got two dedicated conservators who get contractor support, but they specialize in the conservation of maritime archaeological artifacts that originate, in this case, only from Navy sunken military craft. They've got over 30,000 artifacts in their collection.
That is quite a collection of artifacts.
Yeah. They loan them out to museums, which is where the curation part comes in. Once they're finished conserving them, they curate them. We have our archive of artifacts, and then we can study those. During the conservation process, there's extra research and stuff that takes place. The policy management is where the Sunken Military Craft Act comes in. That's our reason for being. But essentially, that's the legislation part of the job, right? We have a permitting process that falls under that for folks that want to do any disturbance activity on our sunken military craft. And then we deal with the legal side of ownership of wrecks, where they are, if they're in foreign waters, how do we deal with that? So there's policy questions, legal questions that come up that we need to deal with. And then the public outreach is kind of what you're seeing or hearing right now. So we go attend events, we try and host events if we can. We do things like this, we make videos, we're trying to increase our social media presence when we can, just to increase awareness. And that's also one of the most effective tools for us for protecting sunken military craft, because the more people know about them and the importance of them and the relevance of them and the history behind them, the more we think that they'll be inclined to help protect them, rather than us just telling them, don't go there, or don't touch it, or don't do this. It helps better if we explain the why and the how and give them a tangible link to those things so that they can be an active participant in their protection rather than just kind of an observer from the side.
I'm glad that you brought up the Sunken Military Craft Act, which turns 20 this year.
Yes, it does.
How does it help the ships and aircraft that were earlier mentioned?
So you already mentioned it's 20 years old, so it was enacted in 2004. So there's a couple of ways it does it. First of all, it gives us legal definitions for things. So I mentioned sunken military craft earlier. That is any craft that is performing a non-commercial military government function at the time of sinking. So cargo vessels are exempt, but that is the definition of SMC. So it's something that we can point at and say, okay, well, is this an SMC? Because that's usually the first question with a new site. Then it also includes any associated contents, is what we call it, with the SMC. It's also still property of the USN or US Navy. That includes cargo, human remains, if there are any, oil, fuel, anything that was on or in the ship or craft is still property of the U.S. Navy. And that's kind of what I'm alluding to with ownership. It states that the U.S. Navy has never relinquished title to any of its sunken military craft, and that is backdated in perpetuity. So in the Navy's case, effectively till 1775 or 1776. Anything after that still retains title. It could go down during the Revolution. It could go down yesterday. It's still a sunken military craft, and the Navy will not relinquish title. So it remains the property of the United States government. And that's important because that comes into maritime law. Because you need to be able to establish a claim in maritime law. You need to be able to exert your influence and stuff like that. It gives us jurisdictional power within U.S. waters particularly, but also outside U.S. waters and international and foreign waters. And then crucially for us, because I mentioned earlier we have 18,000 sunken military craft around the world, it's about a 50-50 split between domestic U.S. waters and international and or foreign waters. So that means we've got thousands of SMCs out in international or foreign waters. There's an international reciprocity that is established within the SMCA, or Sunken Military Craft Act, with foreign powers. So what that means is that there are foreign SMCs within U.S. waters. French, British, Spanish are probably the most prevalent. And there's a couple of German U-boats, for example, off the East Coast and stuff like that. But what that means is that if they allow us to protect them through international agreements, then we can work with them to protect our SMCs abroad. You know, you can imagine, given the history of the United States Navy, that especially working with Great Britain, Australia, France, Germany is very beneficial to our cause.
Right.
So it gives us a legal framework. It also gives us legal teeth. And what I mean by that is it outlines punishments for, in this particular case, U.S. citizens that violate the SMCA. So you get a fine for every day that they violate it. We can also initiate the seizure of assets that were used during the violation of the act. So boats, trucks, whatever, to stop that from happening. So it gives a clear legal definition. It gives us jurisdiction to act on the legal definition. And then finally, it also provides the stick approach, where we have legal consequences in place for violation of the act, so that there's, you know, a reason to follow it beyond the ethical ones.
So for those listeners out there that may be recreational divers and they're interested in diving on a military craft, how does someone go about getting that permission?
Right. So that's a really good question, actually. So under the SMCA and under the permitting process that I mentioned, there's two key differences, there's one key difference in types of activities that you can perform on an SMC. So there are disturbance and non-disturbance activities. Now, the name kind of says it, but non-disturbance activities kind of fall under the take only pictures, leave only bubbles approach if you're a scuba diver. But so diving is totally fine because you're not moving any sediment, you're not moving anything from the wreck, you're not removing anything, you're not shifting stuff around, you're not damaging or changing the wreck environment or the sunken military craft's environment in any way. So there's no potential damage being suffered by the wreck. So that means you can dive on it as long as you're not touching stuff and moving stuff. You can take photographs, you can take video, you can snorkel above it, you can boat above it, you can fish above them as long as your nets don't mess up and stuff. You can do, for the archaeological or scientific side, you can perform remote sensing using side scan sonar, magnetometer, sub-bottom profile, all of those, because none of that activity will disturb the actual wreck. So you can perform all of those activities. Then the disturbance sides, again, name kind of speaks for itself. What it means, you're removing sediment. You're excavating from the scientific side. You're removing bits of or parts of the SMC. So either you're recovering stuff or you're shifting stuff around. You might have to shift them to a different location, stuff like that. So anything that disturbs the wreck, excavation, construction is one that we come across quite often. Salvage, we don't come across quite often, but what I mean by that is the recovery of certain stuff. The removal of UXO is one that's come up.
Unexploded ordnance.
Yes, exactly. In some cases, there's been arguments made for the removal of oil or bunker fuel from wrecks. So stuff like that actively disturbs the wreck, and you need a permit to perform those activities from us. And that would be on top of any permit that you might already need. So say you're doing an excavation in North Carolina, you'd need a North Carolina archaeology permit from the North Carolina office or SHPO office, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, to perform that. But on top of that, you would also need the UAB or SMCA permit that allows you to perform these activities on a sunken military craft. So it doesn't supersede anything, it supplements anything.
So you mentioned penalties earlier in the SMCA. Are there reporting policies or mechanisms on how you do this for people who see things, or how does your office find out about people who are diving illegally?
So there's a couple ways. Sometimes we hear about it. Sometimes we hear about it in the news. Sometimes we see it. Sometimes folks where we know, we've established a relationship with the local population and they hear about somebody going out and salvaging stuff from the wreck and they report back to us because we have a working relationship with them. In other cases, they can report it to the law enforcement. I know when I worked in Florida that Fish and Wildlife is a really common one just because they're quite often, they're out and active in those marine environments. So you can report it there, and then ideally they would kind of figure it out and get in contact with us, or if they know it's a Navy craft, they'd look that up and get in contact with us through that. So it's that way. Otherwise, there's contact information on our website, and you can email us there or call us there and report any potential violations directly, and then we can work with local partners, local law enforcement to investigate that as needed.
So just a bit ago, you discussed recovered artifacts from military craft, and how does the NHHC Conservation Branch actually go about preserving these items?
Right. So this will be in general terms because each item is a case-by-case basis. But there's a couple items. So first, when it's recovered in the field, we do what's called field conservation. And in the most general and basic of terms, that means keep it wet. You try and use water from the site location to keep it wet until it gets to the lab. Then once it gets to the lab, it depends on the material that the artifact is made out of, what the full conservation process is going to be. So brass is treated differently, metal's treated differently, iron is treated differently, wood is treated differently. Composite artifacts, meaning artifacts composed of more than one type of material, even if it's just two, require different approaches because the right approach for wood might damage the iron bindings on a musket or something like that. But the right approach for the iron bindings might damage the wood. But there's alternatives to each one of these treatments, and the conservators are really good at finding that balance that works for both pieces and making sure that the whole artifact is then conserved. The other thing that I want to make sure that people understand about the conservation side of things is that can take a long time. A good rule of thumb is the bigger the artifact, the longer it takes. The more complex the artifact, the longer it takes. And by complex, I mean the more materials, the more moving parts, the more small pieces, stuff like that. And larger, we've got cannons that were recovered from the schooner Revenge that was a wreck in 1811 off of Rhode Island. They were recovered in 2017, or one of them was recovered in 2017. They're still being conserved. And that's not because of a lack of effort. That's just because that's how long it takes. That's multiple tons of iron that need to be desalinated in a solution. The concretion needs to be removed. It needs to be, each step is documented, photographed, drawn if needed. On one of them, they found maker's marks from the ordnance manufacturers that needed to be documented in greater detail or conserved in a different or slightly different way. So just bear in mind, once you see news of a recovery, it could still take years before you see those items in their finished state in a museum.
Talking about these unique items that have been brought up for conservation, like the Revenge cannon and the musket, could you discuss some of the other projects that the Underwater Archaeology Branch has worked on in the past?
Sure. So most recently, there's been a couple field projects that have been ongoing. One of them is in the Patuxent River. So this one's been going on almost a decade, I think, actually. But it started with the search for the War of 1812 Chesapeake flotilla that was under Commodore Joshua Barney. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, essentially that was the force that was assigned to combat the British Navy's raiding up and down the Chesapeake Bay. Ultimately, that Chesapeake flotilla was pushed back. They retreated up the Patuxent River, and they scuttled and burned their vessels on that stretch of river. So we've gone in over time. We think we have identified the flagship Scorpion, but we're trying to locate the 14 or 15 other vessels that were present. Some of them are Navy, most of them are Navy vessels. There's a couple of potential merchant vessels that were also scuttled and burned at the time. Now, there's a couple challenges with that. The river now in 2024 is not the same as it would have been in 1814 or 1815. The whole course of the river might have shifted, sometimes by up to several miles. So we've done historical research. We have an internship program. One of our interns actually helped consolidate a lot of the historical maps and stuff like that to try and identify some key points for us. The other challenge there, and we kind of talked about that at the beginning of the podcast with how is our job different, was our environmental. So there is still water there. The river is 10 to 20 feet deep, depending on where you are. But a lot of the other stretches neighboring the river are marshland. So the river is tidal, so sometimes the marshland is flooded. Sometimes it's, in very large quotation marks, dry, but it turns into mucky swampland. And we have terrestrial equipment, but we can't really use it as effectively in there. So that's actually where technology has helped us out. The rise of UAVs has helped us, and we have an aerial magnetometer that we've been trying to use to identify those sites. And to give a comparison, on foot they were able to cover, it was something like 1.5 acres or 2 acres in a week or something. In 1 week of droning, they covered over 150 acres. So it's an exponential in coverage. And then we're working with other commands and other partner groups to see if that data set from the aerial magnetometer matches up with some of the marine stuff that we've done before. And that way we can also identify other hotspots, hopefully out in the marshlands, and see what we can do there. That's one. There's a couple of new discoveries that have come out recently. There's the USS Albacore last year, World War II submarine. There's USS Harder, which is another World War II submarine. USS St. Lo, which was an escort carrier for all World War II stuff. From the conservation curation side of things, Houston has continued to be one. That's the USS Houston, which is a cruiser that was lost at the beginning of World War II in the Java Sea. About in 2016, UA staff went out there and documented the wreck site. A diver who had recovered a trumpet without knowing what the consequences of that were. That trumpet was returned to UA and then conserved by our conservation staff. And it was a really good example, actually, of how research continues outside of the field. So they conserved it before anybody asked. It's not working. You can't play anything on it. It is damaged, but it is conserved to what its historical state would have been at the time of sinking. But it allows an interesting insight to life on board. So we do know that USS Houston had a band on board. We can't confirm that this trumpet was part of the band because we don't see any USN or US Navy official markings on it. That doesn't necessarily exclude that solution, but the other possibility is that this was a personal effect that somebody had on board. If a sailor wants to or is able to or has the space to, more importantly.
Space is a premium.
Yep. They might be able to bring a trumpet on board at that time. Then they chased up the type and make of the trumpet. It fits the time frame. It was made before World War II. So it definitely would have been available to anybody. But it's a fun way, or it's an interesting way to think about life on board of a cruiser in World War II. Even that recently, we don't know everything about what happened on board. And then from the curation side, this was a really important artifact for the USS Houston Survivors Group that we work with. It's very tangible. People can recognize it, which is really important from our side. It's something we can look at and point at and say, oh, somebody will go, oh, that's clearly a trumpet. And then you can kind of go with the story from there. The other side, then it was actually hosted, or it was housed in the Pentagon for a while. And now it's actually on display at the NHHC, or it will be soon. But it's an important, it speaks to one of those things where it tells a story, of a personal story that you can identify with the sailor who would have held that. And it speaks to the importance of curation and conservation as a continuation of research as well.
You and your coworkers in the Underwater Archaeology Branch made international headlines on a collaborative effort that you did with the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense and their salvage operations staff. Would you mind giving some details about exactly what happened and what was found?
Yeah, sure. So that was in June this year, I think. So that was the handing over by the UK Ministry of Defense of the ship's bell from USS Jacob Jones. Now, USS Jacob Jones is a significant SMC within the U.S. Navy inventory. It is the first U.S. Navy destroyer to be sunk by enemy action. It was sunk in October 1917 by a German U-boat in or near the Isle of Scilly in the English Channel, I believe. And it sank in less than 10 minutes. There were casualties on board when it went down. Some folks did survive, but it was a very historically significant wreck. It hadn't been located yet. In August of 2022, a group of technical divers based in the UK called Dark Star found and discovered the wreck. They then contacted MOD, or Ministry of Defense in the UK, who then contacted us. We then followed the same kind of plan as with any new discovery, but we reviewed the footage in this case that Dark Star divers had taken of the wreck site, and we compared that to ship's plans, damage reports, historical accounts, stuff like that, to confirm that it was most likely the USS Jacob Jones. The other side of this is that in this case, it was a relatively easy identification. And I only say that because what we're talking about here is the handing over of that ship's bell. So that says USS Jacob Jones on the side of it, which is an almost as literal a smoking gun as you can get in underwater archaeology and the identification of shipwrecks. And to kind of protect the site, because the bell was featured really heavily in international and national media in the UK as well, when the discovery was announced, we wanted to recover the bell, one, to help preserve the site. And I know it seems a little bit backwards, but we know that bells are a prime target for looters and illegal salvers. So we wanted to remove that temptation. And then second, we also wanted to tell the story of the USS Jacob Jones. It's a significant story to the U.S. Navy, and the recovery of that bell assists in the telling of that story. It's something that we can display. We can then launch into telling of the story as a whole. And a ship's bell is one of those artifacts, kind of like the trumpet that we talked about. It's immediately identifiable. In this case, it has the name and the number of the ship on it. So it has a direct association with it, and it speaks to the public imagination. We can talk about that artifact from there. But you talk about how internationally, so because it was in UK waters, it was the UK MOD partnered with USN or UAB. They actually partnered with, it's UK MOD, and then it's their SALMO for short, which is like their salvage operations division, helped recover the bell along with a private contractor that they did. They recovered it, and then they handed it over in an official ceremony at the US Embassy in London to the Vice CNO, and then it was transported to the US to be conserved here on the Navy Yard at the UA lab, where it'll be conserved and then ultimately displayed somewhere.
I find it super amazing that an international coordination of teams were able to come together and help preserve naval history and show that even 100 years later, it's still tangible. The bell still represents those sailors lost and their stories.
Yeah, especially that, and it ties in with a lot of the goals of UA, ties in with the archaeological research that we talked about, ties in with public policy or policy management and stuff like that, public outreach with the press release, dealing with a non-government group of divers, stuff like that. And then it ultimately ends up with the conservation and curation side of UA, and it kind of goes full circle.
Right. So are there any active projects that the Underwater Archaeology Branch is currently working on?
Yeah, so we have an active fieldwork program as well. We've got a couple things that we're looking at. I mentioned the Patuxent as one of our biggest, or the Chesapeake Flotilla is one of our biggest projects ongoing. That's still ongoing, so we're looking to return to that again next year. There's a survey for USS Alligator down in the Keys, which was an 1821 schooner, I believe, that was active in the anti-slavery patrols in the 1820s and wrecked down there. There is a section called Alligator Reef, and they want to confirm the identity of either the ship that reef is named after as the USS Alligator, or there is the potential for it to be somewhere else. Revenge is the site that we continue to return to. It's an 1811 wreck commanded by Oliver Hazard Perry of War of 1812 fame. So before he was sent to the Great Lakes, he ran aground with this vessel and ditched a large number of cannon, and then eventually that wreck was also sunk. So we're looking to confirm the location of the wreck. We have confirmed some of the cannon and stuff like that. I talked about that a little bit earlier with conservation. And then some of the ongoing things that are kind of behind the scenes a little bit more as well is that we continue to respond to requests for information, so the public can reach out to us through the information on our website with any questions. But we also assist other partners. So federal agencies continue to perform marine surveys. The development of wind farms has been a big push for offshore surveys. And when there is the potential or even the suspicion of a presence of an SMC, we consult with them. And we have active consulting parties set up for that, and consult meetings set up with them. We review reports from folks. We deal with our permitting process. If folks want to investigate or disturb SMCs, they have to go through our permitting process. So we sanction or not sanction that as needed. And then we make sure that they stick to the guidelines, and we review any reports that come in. We're continuously dealing with public outreach and stuff. So we're always busy.
So is there anything that you would like to give us for final thoughts or hope that our listeners would take away from today's podcast?
Yeah, so the first one is one that we touched on at the start of the podcast. Take only pictures, leave only bubbles. Now, this is most obvious when you're diving, but this includes activities, snorkeling, swimming, fishing, stuff like that. If you're in or around one of our sunken military craft, don't touch it. Don't disturb it in any way. Don't move anything around. Don't start fanning in the dirt to move dirt around or anything like that. Just make sure it stays the way it is, because that's the best way to preserve them for the future as well and share them with future generations. The other one is to remember that the Sunken Military Craft Act is an existing piece of legislation. It provides additional protection to U.S. Navy craft or U.S. Navy sunken military craft. And it is something that you need to bear in mind when you're acting around those vessels in any capacity. And then finally, the last part I'd leave you with is that we are a public office. We do provide information to the public, and you can reach us. So we have contact information on our website, but you can approach us through there. It is kind of a general email, but through that, it'll end up with the right subject matter expert who can then respond to your inquiry. And we try and keep anybody who reaches out to us involved in any informed of any decisions that are made regarding their inquiries.
That's a memorable expression for anyone diving, especially on military wrecks. Take photos and leave only bubbles.
Yeah, that's good practice regardless, but especially for sunken military craft, take photos and leave only bubbles.
Well, Ivor, I want to thank you for your time you've given us today to talk about Underwater Archaeology Branch and archaeology beneath the waves. To quickly recap, for more information about the Underwater Archaeology Branch, the Sunken Military Craft Act, or other topics discussed in today's podcast, visit history.navy.mil or review the podcast show notes. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Archaeology Beneath the Waves on Anchored in History, Stories of America's Navy.